Greetings, you deep-thinking, deeply generous Herle Burlyites. I asked you, maybe a little trepidatiously last week, if you wouldn't mind dropping us a comment or a rating on the Apple Podcast machine. And for the love of the Ursuline Sisters of St. Angela's Convent in Prelate, did you ever come through? I'll be forever paying some sort of cosmic debt to Kath 182010, who writes, simply put, David Herle has made the most important essential political podcast in Canada right now. His ebullient laughter, along with his sharply fueled rum and coke insights, relax and engage his guests so that they enjoy and genuinely answer his questions. He treats his guests with humility and gives them an honest-to-God chance to explain why the way they think they do. Kath 182010, I'm cheersing you right now with my customary late afternoon on a Friday lemon Hart Rum and Coke. All right. Last week on the panel was our journo. Last week on the pod was our journo panel. This week, our wonko panel. All the essential policy discussions we can fit into 60 minutes. The most important issues Canada is facing right now. With me are three of the best people we could be talking to about this. Sean Speer last joined us on the pod about 17 months ago. He's assistant professor of public policy at U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Before that, he was a senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He's also a founder and editor-at-large at the very excellent TheHub.ca. Dr. Jennifer Robson was on with us way back in June of 2020, when we were all pandemic babies. She's a program director and associate professor of political management at Carleton University, where she teaches in public policy and research methods. And brand new to the Herle Burly, because he's free, he's unchained, is Tyler Meredith. Tyler is the former head of fiscal and economic policy for Prime Minister Trudeau and Ministers of Finance Chrystia Freeland and Bill Morneau, who has, as of about 3 months ago, transitioned back to civilian life. Hear more about that later. Tyler, Jennifer, Sean, thanks so much for making the time today. I'm super looking forward to this discussion. How are you all?
Pretty good. Yeah. How are you doing?
I'm getting over a bad flu, but I am getting over it. I feel better. It's this pod I am drinking. This pod is going to have that late Friday afternoon vibe to it. And for the listeners, the pod is late because I was sick this week. Sorry, not COVID. Amazingly, still record unbroken of not having COVID. But I wanted to get this group of people together because I think you're also fucking smart. And we spend a lot of time on this show talking to sometimes politicians about what they're doing, sometimes people in stakeholder groups who want to talk about a certain issue in a certain perspective. But you're all more generalists than that, and yet deeply informed about two things, one of which is what government is doing and not doing. And the second thing is what's happening in society and what the big issues facing the country really are. Those issues may or may not be poll well, they may or may not be top of mind for Canadians, or they may be. But nonetheless, what I want to talk about today is the three of you, what's on your mind when you're thinking about the country? And how are we doing? Is the government doing something about that you like or don't like? Or is the government not doing anything about it? Or is it not even a governmental issue? Anyway, take it away. And Jennifer, I'm going to lob that to you to start with.
Damn you. Okay. I wasn't prepared for starting off here. And I feel underprepared. All I've got is my little measly water bottle. I didn't know that this was a rum and coke.
But you can take a break and go grab a glass of Chardonnay if you would like.
Ooh, okay. All right. May take you up on that. Okay. That's a really wide, kind of a wide berth. So a couple of things there. I'll start with what I know, which is sort of tax and transfer stuff. And there's been some stuff on there. But before I get into that, let me also just say, I think, and the fact that you just mentioned you're just getting over flu is kind of, very salient for this point. I think that another thing that's really on my mind is the fact that we are all still pretending that the pandemic is over, and all governments are pretending the pandemic is over. And, paid attention to what came out just the other day from, the chief science advisor federally about finally getting our head around some clinical guidelines for the treatment of long COVID. But meanwhile, look, like we're still in a world now where There's RSV, there's flu, there's COVID, and all the rest of it. And yet government seems to kind of had decided to sort of down tools on whether it's everything from public health monitoring, basic education stuff, encouraging people in a consistent, clear way to actually use masks so that we don't have to go into lockdown. And I see this as having this has a real impact in terms of the economy. Like there are real supply constraints right now, and some of those are related to Vladimir Putin needs to get his ass out of Ukraine. But some of it is going to be related to the fact that there's this ongoing issue of people being unable to show up to work because they're fighting one flu or the next, right? And we're seeing that in terms of what's going on in the healthcare systems and in right now, crises in terms of everything from pediatric care to over-the-counter medicines. So, I mean, that's kind of a broad overarching.
So I've assumed, Jennifer, that governments have stopped doing anything about that because they can't do anything about that, because the public has lost its will to be curfewed or locked down or masked.
So,
excuse me.
Public willingness to comply, for sure, is definitely changed, right? And you need the consent of the governed to be able to do this. But it doesn't mean that governments give up on things like public health monitoring, public reporting, education efforts. I hate the term lockdown. We were never actually physically locked in our houses. But we could be doing a hell of a lot more in terms of clear, evidence-based information and advice to our fellow citizens with regards to simple measures that we could all take that we keep each other and ourselves a little bit safer. And anyway, that's one thing that's sort of an overarching umbrella issue.
Well, let's put our buddy on the spot here. Tyler, what can you tell us about why the government changed it, the federal government at least, has changed its approach on this so radically over time?
Well, I'm not sure that they have changed their approach so radically, right? I mean, the core thing that the federal government has done as part of its response to COVID has been to be able to buy vaccines, get material in the hands of provinces, and prop up the economy. And it's still basically doing a version of that. I mean, on the public health side, obviously, we've had to shift, the federal government has had to shift on the vaccine mandate, and that's an important issue. But all of these, a lot of what Jennifer was talking about in terms of like the public health decisions about masking and what's happening with schools, all that's at a provincial level. I mean, and what's interesting, but
there used to be strong moral suasion out of Ottawa on these things.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, yes, I take the point on that. But to an extent, you could even say that the recent update that the Chief Public Health Officer has been providing, and the kind of warnings that we have heard going into the holiday season about just the return of the normal flu and some of these other viruses that are now circulating, that is the federal government doing its job as a kind of information sharer, right? In the very traditional core public health role that, frankly, I think a lot of us took for granted prior to COVID. I think what we haven't done, and I take Jen's point about the fact that the pandemic, quote unquote, isn't over, but we're all acting like it. I think what we haven't done, though, is at the same time stopped and paused to take a lesson about what are the things that that have been exposed through COVID that are challenges or failings or gaps that were in our systems, whether they be from public health or income security, and actually moved with a bit of urgency to try to fix those. I think that's actually, certainly at the federal level, what I think where we haven't kind of shifted to yet.
David, can I pick up your big picture point about what is the big issue that I'm thinking about as we come to an end of 2022? For me, it's what you might describe as the return of political economy, and in particular, a changing paradigm about the West's relationship with China. On my point about political economy, take, for instance, the extent to which, in hindsight, Germany's thinking about climate change and energy policy has had significant geopolitical and national security implications. On China, we've seen out of the Trudeau government an Indo-Pacific strategy, which in my view represents a significant change in the way that the Canadian government is thinking and talking about Canada's relationship with China. I mean, just think about it. It wasn't long ago that we were aiming for free trade, and even the government was negotiating vaccine deals with the Chinese government. And today, it's calling China a significant geopolitical foe, talking about the subject of decoupling, and even kicking Chinese companies out of their investments in Canadian companies. It's a significant reversal of a strategy of engagement, which has been reflected across successive governments dating back to the Chrétien years. And I think a recognition that China is fundamentally a geopolitical and technological rival and possibly even an enemy. And I would say that this change is personified in Industry Minister Champagne, who was previously trade minister when the government was consulting on free trade negotiations with China. And if you go to the government website, you can actually find a statement from him from that period talking about the great business opportunities that can flow from a stronger economic relationship with China. Compare that to the present, where, as I say, the government is now talking about decoupling and even stronger national security provisions around Chinese investment in Canada. This is a sea change. It's a long time coming. I happen to think it's a good thing. But as far as I'm concerned, it has far-reaching implications beyond anything else policymakers have been talking about over the past 12 months, including some of the issues that Jen and Tyler rightly raised about the pandemic and its implications for healthcare system, income security, everything else. Those are all important, but those are in a way are kind of old issues. What I'm talking about is a kind of structural issue that's going to have implications for our economic policy, for our national security policy, and virtually everything else in between.
Sean, I just want to follow up with something, because a person can hear what you said and assume that we used to have an incorrect policy and now we have a correct policy. But my rather admittedly superficial understanding of this is that what's happening is a natural reaction to a strong change in Chinese government policy based on the new ruler. And that for a long time, there was lots of reason for the Western consensus that China was evolving toward a more liberal state and could be ultimately trusted to be part of the management of global affairs and the economy. And that under Xi, that's changed, and it changed incrementally at first and then radically. And governments, I don't know, maybe they're a year behind catching up, but they're not a decade behind catching up.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. The way I would put it, David, is that successive governments, I'm not making a partisan critique of anyone, successive governments, not just in Canada, but really around the West, made a bet, and it was a reasonable bet at the time, that economic integration with China would create the conditions for not just Chinese prosperity, but ultimately something representing democratic reform. And I think after more than a quarter century of observing that bet, we started to see countries like Australia, New Zealand, the Americans, and now Canada, in effect, revisit some of those assumptions, based, as you say, on what we're witnessing within China, but also the extent to which the Chinese government is articulating an economic and geopolitical strategy that is far more ambitious and aggressive than we've seen in a long, long time. And so, as I say, I think I would not underestimate the significance of the Indo-Pacific strategy that was rolled out over successive weeks by this government. And the fact that it reflects things that conservatives have been saying for the past couple of years suggests that this is a durable change in Canadian policy vis-a-vis China. That is to say, it's not going to fundamentally change if we see a change in government in the next federal election.
Tyler?
Yes?
Tyler, I had been worried. I don't know what to make of the new Indo-Pacific strategy. I'd like to hear from you about what I should make of the new Indo-Pacific strategy. I had been worried that our country's interest with respect to China were compromised somewhat by deeply embedded significant corporate interests from Canada in China that had a significant influence over government policy making in this area and the approach the government took to China. Was I right to have that fear?
I don't know about fear. I mean, I think to the point that Sean made earlier, which I very much agree with. I mean, I think successive governments did clearly make a bet that there was an opportunity for China and for Canada to work together, if not towards free trade, towards some kind of integration economically and in terms of investment, that over time would pay off in either continued liberalization in democratization in China and integration economically, particularly on the West Coast for Canada. That clearly hasn't happened. I think it wasn't so much about business interests. I think it just took the government and society and Canadian society a while to realize that there was a pivot that probably needed to happen. And partly that pivot happened at a time in which we realized there were fewer friends with which the country itself could rely on and deal with. And we were seeing that at the very same time as the United States, right? Than Canada had traditionally dealt with in the past. And that's a pretty difficult place to be in terms of figuring out, well, who do I want to work with when there aren't as many reliable partners with whom Canada can work as in the past. And it's taken some time for us to figure that out. I mean, I think what's interesting about the Indo-Pacific strategy, right, is I think probably the most important thing that it represents as a change in set of policies is tone and just the way it was said by the government in frankly pretty forceful language, the likes of which I think, a year or two ago, you might not have expected to hear. But what's interesting is that it was a strategy that also didn't come with it anything on the defense side that you would have assumed, or in other governments you might have assumed would have been paired with that. There were a series of investments that were made, and those are interesting. And as Sean rightly points out, the stuff on the Investment Canada Act is quite consequential and significant. But the fact that the defense component wasn't there, I think, is interesting just as a statement. In part because also the Indo-Pacific strategy is happening before we figured out what we're doing with all of the other investments in defense that the government has indicated it wants to make.
Time for a happy story, Herle Burlyites. 'Tis the season, so it's about giving. Specifically, it's about giving hope. And the story begins with a girl named Olivia, living out in Edmonton. Some years ago, Olivia was diagnosed with Rett syndrome, a genetic condition where a child progressively loses speech, movement, and coordination of the body. But I said this was a happy story, and here's why. Olivia's life has been changed recently as a result of a local community grant from the TELUS Future Friendly Foundation to the Glen Rose Rehabilitation Hospital Foundation. She has a new piece of technology, straight out of the lab, called a BCI, Brain-Computer Interface. It's a specialized headset connected to Olivia's brain that takes her neural signals and turns them into commands. Literally, it turns her thoughts into action. So Olivia is now able to push and pull objects like a ball to paint with or use to play with her sister and pet dog. She's even learning to control her wheelchair with BCI, engaging physically with her family and others in ways she never could before. Olivia's is just one giving story of the TELUS Friendly Future Foundation, an independent registered charity that believes all youth, regardless of their circumstances, deserve an equal opportunity to reach their full potential. In 2022, there have been 548 such stories, totaling over $10.5 million. Next week, we'll tell you another, but it's giving season after all, and you can learn more about the foundation right now at friendlyfuture.com. Tell me about this. I mean, how do you manage something like this as the Western world? Because we don't really have, I don't know, a unique Canadian interest here. There's a Western world interest that we're a part of, and as I can tell, maybe people would talk about the Arctic. I don't know anything about the Arctic, but it doesn't seem to me to be the first line issue for us. So we're part of a Western alliance that, given what China's behavior is like now, given it is completely entrenched as an autocracy, given its treatment of minorities, given its aggression toward Taiwan and Hong Kong, and its clearly global ambitions, it's awfully tempting to tell them just to go fuck themselves. And however, isn't it also the case that the world's never safer when people aren't talking? And second of all, that some issues like climate change could literally be the end of civilization if we can't work together to get this done. So how do How do you finesse that?
Well, I'm not sure that you do finesse that, right? Like, I think you actually have to be realistic with people about the challenges that we face in society. And, and I'm going to answer this with a point that you may not be expecting. But one of the really fascinating things that I've seen in the last week, if you look at that Leger poll that recently came out that was focused on people under 40, right? So it asked them, what are the things that you fear? What are things that you fear about? What are the things that you're worried about? And, obviously at the top of the list, people were worried about sociologically is our government's working on their behalf. But it clearly indicated that they are worried about things like climate change, right? Like, young people today are actually worried about what it represents as an existential threat to our planet. And I think, whether it is climate change or whether it is, how do you engage in the world in a way that promotes your democratic values, and who are the partners with whom you want to engage with geopolitically to express those values, because you just see kind of the chaos that exists elsewhere. I think you just have to be actually very realistic with people, because having gone through the turbulence that we have faced in our own lives from COVID, but all of the other attendant chaos that we've dealt with as a society in the last number of years, I think this is a time in which you actually have to be very honest and upfront with people about the challenges that we face, because otherwise, I think we all just know that the world is a lot more problematic than probably we liked to admit a few years ago.
David, let me just take up your question about Canada's relationship to other countries as it relates to China. I don't think it's an accident that a lot of the major pronouncements that presaged the Indo-Pacific strategy were actually articulated in Washington. Think of Minister Freeland's major address at the Brookings Institution. Think of the fact that Minister Champagne was starting to talk about decoupling on a visit to Washington. Think of the fact that after it was released on a Sunday, we had a statement from the ambassador the American ambassador in Canada, lauding the articulation of this more hawkish poise vis-a-vis China. I interpret the strategy and the way it rolled out is the Trudeau government essentially saying we are choosing to belong to the American camp in this new geopolitical context. I think we all kind of understood that that's where we would ultimately end up. But I think the way it was rolled out, the way it's been received, we are fundamentally making that choice. And with that comes a series of knockoff choices. Think, for instance, about the decision on the part of the American Congress to enable Canada to effectively participate in their electric vehicle subsidies. Think of kind of growing collaboration on a kind of continental focus on some of these climate issues, including as it relates to our electric vehicle mandates. I do think that, there's a lot of debate, David and Jennifer and Tyler will know this, about whether the Cold War framing is obscures or clarifies. We don't need to get into that, but I do think it is self-evident that the consequences of this announcement, Tyler talked about tone. I would even go so far as to say, I think it reflects a change in the way we conceptualize, not just talk about, but conceptualize policymaking as it relates to China. I think it's a really big deal. And as I say, the fact that you didn't hear a lot of criticism out of the Conservatives except to say something like it took too long to manifest itself means that it does represent a bipartisan change in Canadian policymaking, which is going to affect research and development policy, investment policy, foreign policy, trade policy, maybe as Tyler said.
Okay, but how is it going to affect those things? Jennifer, let me ask you this. One of the most interesting parts of this, and Sean was getting into it, is friendshoring. Minister Freeland sort of has now laid out as almost a centerpiece of Canadian economic policy going forward.
Yep.
Now, but I don't really understand what that means. Like, are they going to put up tariffs that will force Apple to make iPhones in a NATO country? Unlikely.
That probably wouldn't withstand a WTO challenge. Look, here's how I interpret it. And let me first of all just say, your two other guests this week are two of the smartest people. So this is a fun conversation to try and keep up with, and I'm really enjoying Tyler Unfettered and Unbound, as you put it. And Sean is always just enormously thoughtful on a wide range of issues. So your question about friendshoring, look, here's how I think about it. We have become, and I would actually take a little bit of issue in the sense that Sean's point about this being a sort of a policy shift that has bipartisan support. I would also say this has been a policy challenge that had bipartisan struggles, frankly, in Canada, right? Like the Harper government struggled. Like if you just track, for example, the one file of Huawei, right? Are we going to allow them in or not? Right? Like there was just huge ambivalence across, two successive governments there. So in terms of friendshoring, here's what I think is that I, like Sean, interpret the signals that were sent in Washington and that have also been sent from Washington to suggest that, look, the Americans have basically decided you're out or you're in, right? And it is much better, much safer for Canada to be in than it is to be out. That said, we have been hooked for a long time on cheap goods, cheap stuff from China, right? And to the extent that the current economic woes that we are facing are, somewhere between 75% and 85%, depending on the estimates that you look at, supply chain driven. I also interpret this policy change as being informed by the fact that people are starting to realize that actually that flow of cheap goods from China may not actually be as reliable as we had taken for granted. Now, what does this mean in terms of, your question about going forward? So sure, yeah, it's going to require a pretty tough, heavy lift in terms of change to supply chains. Greater focus on some of those other Indo-Pacific countries, but Canada, so the challenge.
Don't hide behind the buzzwords, Jennifer. Is this the end of globalization and internet and global free trade?
I don't do foreign policy.
Come on, is it?
Is it? No, it's just a shift in what that's going to look like, right? The history of globalization is not exactly a 20th century invention, right? Or, this is not going to be the end of it. It's just going to be a shift in terms of where Canada's focus and interests are. But let me just say this part is that I take the point that this has been announced separate and apart from a defense policy strategy, because the defense policy renewal is still, that's still a work in progress. Stay tuned, that kind of thing. But Canada, for this to work on, international relations and diplomacy, and frankly, on the trade side as well, Canada's going to actually have to show up and do something and be present in a meaningful way in that region.
We're not going to spend any significant amount of money. We're not going to spend any significant amount of money on military hardware. Debate me.
Well, I won't take up that debate, but I will take I will take up the debate on globalization. I think the extent to which globalization is a descriptor of an economic policy framework that essentially defers to markets on the allocation of production, I think then the answer is yes, this does represent something like the end of globalization, that countries like the United States and Canada are going to, in certain cases, say, no, we have national interests that trump the market allocation of certain forms of production. Think, for instance, of the CHIPS Act in America, which I think is actually the single most important policy development in 2022. We have bipartisan support from Republicans and Democrats essentially saying we are going to use the levers of power and public policy to, in effect, cultivate a domestic semiconductor and chips capacity within our borders. We're not going to just let markets decide where that production takes place. I think that's a huge deal, and I think we're going to see it manifest itself in other parts of the economy. The key here, David, and you'll know this so well, is we got to put some belts and suspenders on this, or you can see it devolving into statism and autarky, right? We may have a national interest in making sure we can produce vaccines in our country. We probably don't have a national interest or national security concern around whether we can produce T-shirts. And it's going to be up to policymakers to effectively articulate how they think about what's strategic, what's critical, and where we are going to intervene in markets and where we're going to let markets do what markets do. And I think that is a big question going forward in 2023?
I'm just going to add one thing to what Sean said, because I agree, and I also agree with what Jen said, that friendshoring is a incredibly consequential change in how we think about the policy levers that promote growth and how and what that represents. But I actually think this is not the end, David, of globalization, because globalization's actually been under challenge for a much longer time than we like to admit. If you charted trade as a share of GDP over the course of time, it peaked within the last decade globally, but it peaked in Canada earlier than that. It peaked in Canada actually about 20 years ago. And so we are actually less of a trading nation today than we were at the turn of the century. And I think that would surprise a lot of people, given how much we talk about free trade and market access and what's the next region that we're going to
Is that because we don't export goods anymore?
Well, we do export goods. We just happen to export, we go back and forth between our commodities and our manufactured products, right, that we export. But we're not as much of a trading nation as we used to be. And Canada's just kind of, we've done a lot of work between conservative governments and liberal governments to push the agenda of market access. And we've had a lot of great success in getting those agreements, CETA, CPTPP. But the agreements increasingly aren't the thing that guarantee you the trade, right? It's the other stuff that lies behind that. It's the intercommercial relationships, it's supply chain arrangements, it's the access to capital. And what friendshoring represents is it's a shift in how all those arrangements are happening. And I think what's interesting about friendshoring is, it is long-term where a lot of Western economies have to go. And I think it's just, we've woken up to that fact in a way today that even before Donald Trump came on the scene with what he was doing in steel and aluminum and other industries, we probably weren't admitting to ourselves we needed to think about. But the challenge with friendshoring is the short term, right? It's like, how do you actually shift those supply chain arrangements in a way that doesn't cause inflationary pressures at a time when inflation is actually quite high? That's the trick. It's going to be very challenging to watch how that plays out in the US and Canada and other places, because, we're in a very sensitive environment for that right now.
Hey, Jennifer, these two guys are describing, including Sean, these two guys are describing what sounds to me like a geopolitically driven industrial strategy. Right? Is that dirty word back in the thing? Do we have government planning the economy now about where investments are made and what kind of investments are?
Look, governments have always tried to shape where investments go and flow, right, with varying degrees of success, right?
But this has been so out of vogue for 40 years now. 20 years. 25
strategy.
years.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, there's a ton of stuff that's actually already still there in our tax policy, right? That is effectively doing the exact same thing. It's just part of the furniture now, so we don't even pay attention to it anymore. Bears looking at. But yeah, this sort of like doing it out in the open blatantly is maybe it is a shift, right? I don't know that it's necessarily a dirty word, except that paying attention to, as Tyler was saying, right, to the current domestic pressures that we face in terms of inflation, cost of living for households and all the rest of it. That's going to be a tricky thing for policymakers to manage. Trust us, we need to get off this gravy train of the cheap goods from China. It's going to hurt for a little while. We need to try out a couple of things and see what sticks to the wall. In the meantime, it may not be so comfortable for you. That's not going to be an easy sell.
There's also the state capacity question. Like, all four of us have spent time within the government, and what we're talking about here, David, represents a high level of ambition around the government's ability to, in effect, engineer certain market outcomes based on national interest or national security. At the same time, we have outstanding questions about the federal government's ability to deliver on a lot of these things. As Jennifer and Tyler know, Ottawa, in many ways, has become a big cash register that's principally responsible for transferring money to individuals and to other orders of government. Its capacity, particularly around these questions of industrial policy, has atrophied over the past quarter century or so. So, I'm articulating, what a kind of role for public policy that will surprise some of my conservative friends. And I think where they have a legitimate set of criticisms is, can we trust Ottawa to do this? And my only rebuttal is it wasn't that long ago that we didn't really have a trade negotiation capacity in Ottawa, right? And it took a lot of time over successive governments to build that capacity. And today, the government of Canada is recognized around the world as a leader on free trade negotiations. There's a reason, for instance, that the Brits came to Canada first after Brexit. And so it's not about the size of government going forward, it seems to me, but it's fundamentally about, do we have that capacity if we're going to have to use the levers of policy to make sure we can produce vaccines, or that we can, mine critical minerals, so on and so on.
So you'll have a fair amount of grain terminology floating around in your head. We all do. You can make the grade. You can blow off steam. You might have bought a new car with all the bells and whistles. Sidetracked, third rail, wrong side of the tracks, blowing smoke, fast-tracked, railroaded, just the ticket. The end of the line. Sabotage. Yes, sabotage is actually a railroad term from France. You can look it up. I could go on. Fact is, railroading language has infiltrated English so thoroughly that you probably don't even know when you're using it. Interesting, eh? Anyway, the folks at our sponsor CN know a thing or two about railroad terms, and their favorite one at the moment is another oldie: leaving the station on time. The thing is, at CN, they mean it literally. Come hell or high water, as one of our former prime ministers liked to say, CN trains leave the station on time. Period. In the past year, leaving the station on time and arriving on time has become a prime directive of the railway. It's actually more complicated than it sounds. CN basically has one set of tracks connecting the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Gulf of Mexico. In some places, there are sidings for trains to park on, and other parts of the network are double-tracked. But it's not like a 6-lane highway. Leaving the station on time means making sure the tracks ahead are clear and coordinating the dozens of 2-mile-long trains rolling along the network at any given moment, not to mention making sure they're loaded on time and there's someone waiting to unload them at the other end so they can start another long haul. But CN has been doing it, and as a result, the velocity of CN's trains haven't been as good in years. To most of the world, velocity means speed, but to a railway, it means the average number of miles its trains cover in a day. And what that crucial number means is good service, as in, making the trains run on time. Where service is concerned, CN has sort of a one-track mind, tunnel vision even. All right, let's move on. Tyler, fresh out of government, all the stuff you've been involved in and worked on, now that you're not there and you don't have to think about anything, what do you still think about?
And this is actually a roundabout way to your original question about what's on my mind for the next year. I would say that I think about the longer term changes that are happening in society. So we've talked about deglobalization as one of them. I also am really keeping a close eye on what's happening around the trade-off between inflation and growth, and how are countries around the world going to navigate that, because it will present a series of very interesting and challenging issues, the likes of which policymakers in all countries, frankly, have not had to deal with for 30 or 40 years, and we don't really have a proper game plan to deal with this for the reasons that Jen mentioned, which are the likes of what we're facing right now are just so foreign to anyone who would even have a playbook for this stuff, because it's a supply problem more or less, not a demand side problem, or that's how I would characterize it, and I think how the data suggests it is. But the other thing is, I'm also really thinking a lot about what's happening with decarbonization. And, interestingly, David, if you watch the Prime Minister's speech earlier this week that he gave to the Liberal caucus Christmas party, which I think a few media outlets picked up, and I was in the room, so it was interesting for me to kind of receive that now that I'm out of government as more of just an active.
It's different when you don't write it, isn't it?
But what was interesting, I found at that speech, was there was a whole section in there about what does sustainable decarbonized growth and a growth agenda in that context look like for Canada, right? Which is something you've obviously talked about on the podcast before, because it's a uniquely Canadian challenge. And I'll tell you, some of the loudest applause lines that he got was in that section of the speech. It was the fact that, how is Canada going to bring a ZEV manufacturing facility to this, to our industrial base, right? Like, how are we going to find a way to develop clean resources? And how are we going to decarbonize some of our commodities industries? Like, that is the eternal challenge for Canada, because, we have been reliant on these industries to deliver a lot of prosperity. They're a huge source of capital. And as the world is changing, we've got to find a way to remain competitive in those places. And I think it is the eternal challenge for Canada.
Well, do you see any way that Canada comes out of this transition away from carbon a stronger economy than it was before? I don't understand how that could possibly be.
Well, only if we put the emphasis on innovation, right? Like there is certainly an opportunity, I think, around energy systems, right, and battery production.
But that's a wing and a prayer that every country in the world has. Will innovate, right? I mean, that's not a Canadian thing.
No, but certainly, like, in and around the energy system superstructure, because of the reliance that it will have on critical minerals, and because Canada is a substantial resource for those, that is an obvious transition point, as is the opportunity around hydrogen, because again, that represents an immediate transition for some of those alternative uses. But it's going to require, and this is something that certainly I've been thinking about a lot, it will require as much a push on the commercial and industrial side to get those things done, as much as it also will a reinvestment in the fundamental research that we need to drive that stuff, right? Like, I think what's interesting is that we have been talking in Canada a lot like the commercial opportunity and the fundamental research opportunity are two very different things. And we should, because we've invested often a lot in fundamental research, we should focus more on the commercial side. I actually think we got to do all of the above, right? This is an environment where government strategy actually has to be an all of the above approach, because to Sean's point, nobody knows exactly how the world will unfold, but we've got to place bets in a number of places in order to ensure that we will win.
Jennifer.
Why me?
What do you think about that?
Go to Sean. Go to Sean. Seriously, go to Sean.
All right, Sean, what do you got?
I must say, you've got me on a bad day on this subject. I'm feeling increasingly pessimistic. I interviewed you were kind enough to mention my work at the Hub for the Hub podcast, Hub Dialogues, an American physicist and energy scholar named Mark Mills, who's done a lot of thinking on just the magnitude of change represented in the energy transition. Like, it's a kind of concept we talk a lot about, but Mills has done a lot of thinking about what it means practically, and it's left me, I must say, a bit pessimistic about our ability to kind of engineer that change on the timelines that the Parliament of Canada has effectively legislated, right? And so I do think that, particularly in a world where, in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we see European countries and others sort of revisiting the scale of ambition around climate change. I wonder if 2023 doesn't represent a period where countries start to, in effect, slow down their level of commitment and ambition around climate policy. I'm not making a normative judgment, David, Jennifer, and Tyler, on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying, as we get closer and closer to some of these timelines, I'm struck by just how disruptive the objective of the full energy transition truly is.
Well, and compared to how little we've done to this point, right? Like, we're not spreading that pain or adjustment out. We're just leaving it all toward the end. I mean, unless somebody's going to correct me here, I've done years now of interviews on this subject with policymakers, with experts in the climate area, with people from business. There's nothing is happening fast enough to meet the targets that science has told us are immutable. And I don't see any evidence that things are going to move fast enough. And yet I will say that I believe that the Trudeau government has as aggressive a climate change policy as the Canadian population will accept. And in fact, I think I've thought for a long time it's been an aggressive enough policy that it has created political jeopardy for them. And so I don't really see any prospect that it gets more aggressive than it is. So I'm just Jennifer, give us some light at the end of the climate change tunnel.
Oh, that's a heavy lift for me. Look, the one good news is that we actually do have a price on carbon. And I thought it was really interesting just days ago that actually even the Daniel Smith government has agreed to keep pace with the federal price in terms of their major emitters pricing scheme within the province. I realize, right? It's not high enough. It's not fast enough. All the rest of it in terms of actually where we need to get to, but it's not nothing. And so that is one little bit of bright light that I will pay attention to. I'll say again, when we were talking about industrial policy, there are bits and pieces of that have become hardwired in terms of our corporate tax system. That we have probably never actually taken enough of a hard look at in terms of whether or not they are being properly retuned to the major transition that we need to make. Thinking, for example, of the shred tax credit, the flow-throughs, treatment of flow-through shares for mineral exploration, all that sort of stuff. I get it. None of these things is going to add up to enough on its own, but they are at least worth doing and worth trying. I know. This is we've all bet on this Hail Mary pass of we'll keep on the oil pathway for now, and we'll use the revenues to finance the transition and all the rest of it. And I don't do public opinion research, but I trust you when you say, David, that this is probably as about as aggressive as what taxpayers and voters will tolerate for now. That said, in the years ahead, if and when and as climate disasters start to strike people in their own backyards, I wonder if that public appetite might not shift.
Well, maybe. Hey, can I stick with you on the economy for just a bit, Jennifer? Because okay. Tyler had ventured his way into productivity. And productivity is a word that I tried to have banned from the Department of Finance in the 1990s and early 2000s. There were people there that liked to talk about it, and I used to strongly discourage them from talking about it publicly. It's not a term that people like to hear politicians talking about. Sounds like the politicians don't think they're working hard enough, or they're not contributing enough, or something needs to change for the worse in their life so it can change for the better for business. It doesn't have any good connotations. And I've become a real lefty in my old age. I sit here week after week and I mule on about income disparities and about the lack of social support systems and how little we pay our care workers and about all sorts of ills in our society that I believe in genuinely and deeply. But I also recall that I was told many, many years ago, and every study I see says the same thing, that the Canadian economy is not growing fast enough and will not grow fast enough in terms of its core productivity for us to continue to afford our current lifestyle, much less for us to able to expand our society in the ways in which I like to think about it. What do you think about that?
So number one, let me just say, I find that really funny that you were trying to address bureaucraties before it was cool. Look, I spent a bit of time in the federal public service, and I spent it in a place that was sort of an internal think tank. And a lesson that I learned there, which has always stuck with me, is that one of the challenges of talking about productivity is that when you think through the logical argument of what can actually lead to increases in productivity, the list starts to get longer and longer and longer once you start thinking about total factor productivity. And if the list is that long, then the problem that you're in is that if almost anything can increase productivity, then nothing increases productivity, right? That said, yeah, look, we are forecast for a period of slower growth, some of which the Bank of Canada seems keen to accelerate. I know Tyler will probably want to talk a bit about that as well. Some of this has been a long time coming in terms of some of the demographic shifts that we've known for a long time, population aging, reduction in terms of labor force participation. One of the things that I am thinking about, though, right now is not only the near-term impact of what the Bank of Canada is doing in terms of trying to slow the economy and the distributional impacts that is having, which I know, David, that's something that is, as you were saying, is something that you think about as well. But that also, if one of the gains for productivity and for the future of economic growth has to do with, for lack of a better term, investments in technology and innovation. Well, we're currently in an environment where we're making that actually a lot more expensive, right, for businesses to invest in. And we've had a long problem of businesses underinvesting in those areas. I don't know of an easy fix, except that there are these bits and pieces that are obvious in terms of maintaining labor force participation as much as we can. Improving the environment for business expansion, those trade relationships that we talked about earlier. Look, this is a tricky thing. What troubles me, though, is that when the discussion around productivity essentially becomes code for tax cuts, right? That what we need are tax cuts today to finance growth, to improve, the affordability of social programs that we care about later on. And that seems to me slightly twisted.
There's not a strong known correlation.
No, there is not.
Well, or to put it differently, I mean, people 2 decades ago, I think, David, when Jack Mintz was doing his review of the tax system, would have said that there was a correlation. I think we've seen since that it hasn't worked out the way we thought it would, right? Canada, the way I like to think about it is, Canada actually has a lot of great things that it starts from to be able to compete globally for, with our other trading partners. We've got great resources, we've got talented people, and we do have some significant leading advantages in certain industries. But we don't lead in everything, right? And we have to know what we're really good at. And I think what we are finding is, number one, the path to unlocking that growth comes in being resourceful, as the Prime Minister has said, actually at different points in time. It's actually about how you build a future knowledge-based economy that produces a lot of value-added activity. And that's a transition that is hard to move through for an economy like Canada that traditionally has been defined by commodities manufacturing and to a certain extent, things like financial services. But the fact that Toronto, for example, is one of North America's leading tech sectors and has had such explosive growth in terms of employment up to this year, in the last number of years in that space, I think would come as a surprise to a lot of people, including in Ottawa. And we don't, I think we have to think about strategically, how do we unlock that potential of being a competitive, knowledge-based economy with companies and with people that can compete in those areas. And we start with a lot of great resources, but to Jen's point, a lot of it will come on actually how we focus in using the talent that we have. Because really, if I had to describe what our economic...
Okay, I'm just so layman. You got to break through the jargon for me on this, Tyler. What does that mean? What are you talking about? So
Canada is I think is right now trying to position itself as the leader in bringing people here and having people here that are the highest talent and highest potential people, right? And if we do that well, either in terms of access to education, immigration, engagement of people in the labor force, we will unlock potentially higher productivity, right? We will unlock by having by applying those talents that we have from people, we will be able to unlock greater productivity. What I think the challenge that presents in how do you actually execute that is, it requires a housing market that's affordable so that you can keep people here. It requires interesting things for those people to do. And it requires as well a bunch of policies that, as Jen has mentioned, actually brings people into the labor market that as demographics play out, where we just naturally have fewer people available to do all the things that we like to do, we have to dig deeper in how we bring those people into the labor market that traditionally have not been there. And I would say, as you look through that transition, how Canada has been moving along that trajectory, we've done decently well. But this is actually where it gets hard, right? Because this is actually right now, as we're starting to experience, this is when demographics turn against us.
Yeah, the only thing I would say, David, is you in your question that you started this conversation to Jennifer, you talked about slow growth for a better part of 2 decades. Again, a kind of period of sluggish growth that crosses governments, crosses different policy preferences, et cetera. And that period of slow growth has been characterized by some, including economist Tyler Cowen, as a period of great stagnation. And I mentioned earlier that I'm increasingly pessimistic about the energy transition, but let's give your readers some reason for optimism here as we approach the end of 2022. We're having this conversation on December 16th. Guys, in the past 10 days or so, we've experienced some kind of really extraordinary developments in the kind of global economy. We've seen progress on nuclear fusion, which is a big effing deal. We've seen major progress on artificial intelligence and machine learning in the form of Chat GPT, which again,
that damn thing thought I was from Winnipeg,
which again represents a kind of range of positive sum potentials that I think are very exciting. We've seen progress in the past week or so from Moderna on a new drug that seems to be making significant has significant positive outcomes with respect to skin cancer. Like you wouldn't want to be alive in any other time. And progress isn't linear. There's various reasons why it's been slow over the past 20 years. But I mentioned earlier that I just finished an interview with Mark Mills. He's predicting the roaring 2020s because of the convergence of some of these forms of technological progress. And if that manifests itself, not only would you not want to live any other period, you wouldn't want to live in any other place. Don't bet against North America and don't bet against Canada. I'm as optimistic as I've ever been. Yes, of course, policy matters. And, you're going to hear differences from the different parties. And I have my differences, and Jennifer and Tyler. But fundamentally, there are signs that we are poised to kind of break out of this 2% trap that we've been stuck in for 20 years. And if we are, that has not just economic implications, it has implications for how people feel about the economy, the society, the future. I think this is hugely important and reason why I end 2022 feeling as optimistic, David, as I have in a long, long time.
Wow. Well, I wish we were ending there because it's so optimistic, but we're not, because there's so much more that's important we have to talk about. And I can't let this group get off the call. By the way, that was a really, really stimulating and interesting conversation about the economy and decarbonization, everything. Thank you. I love that conversation. But I can't let you get away without talking about healthcare in Canada. And I don't really so much want to talk about what we ought to do in terms of policy. I don't really want to talk about the federal-provincial dialogue that's going on right now, because I think it's a pretty standard game of chicken, and there'll be some saw-off, and it's not that interesting to speculate on what the outcome of that saw-off will be. But let's assume, because every single person I've ever talked to has told me this, that the big check that the feds are going to give to the provinces will not solve the problems in healthcare in Canada. If we start from that assumption, what is a reasonable process for Canada to undertake to come to grips with what we ought to do to reform healthcare so that it does continue to adhere to the principles we want it to adhere to and delivers the kind of service that we want it to deliver at a price in which we think we can afford? This seems to be something that many countries in Europe have, to some degree or another, mastered. Although I presume everybody's going through post-pandemic challenges. But I don't see any way that Canada gets to a different way of delivering healthcare than the way it does right now, unless there's some process that takes us there. What do you think?
I could start. I actually think there is a path forward, and that path runs through Quebec. I think Quebec, because it has a deeper sense of self than English Canada, isn't as committed to the healthcare system, not just as a way to deliver health outcomes, but as part of its sort of core identity. It's also the fact this isn't a partisan observation. Again, it's something that's persisted over the years, but the federal government has been more permissive when it comes to the application of the Canada Health Act vis-a-vis Quebec. So in other words, Quebec tends to have a bit more scope for reform. I actually think we're going to see out of the Legault government kind of pushing the envelope on private delivery through the single payer system, but different forms of private delivery that other provinces will come to adopt. And as I say, I think if you think of the provinces as laboratories of reform, I would be looking at Quebec into 2023 as a place where we're going to kind of see the catalyst for more significant reform across the country.
So maybe I'll go next.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, so I think what we have learned over the course of the last number of decades of having different skirmishes about healthcare is that wherever you start for making reform to healthcare, you have to start by acknowledging and accepting that the principles of the Canada Health Act are going to continue to apply. And I think Canadians want that. And then once you embrace those principles, you then have to have a discussion about, well, we have a conception and a model for funding healthcare that is based on what healthcare does that kind of assumes that it's this thin level of coverage across a whole bunch of stuff, but it's A, not broad enough, and B, not deep enough. And so we first have to agree on what are the things we want to buy with healthcare, because right now we're in some ways buying too much and too little at the same time. And we actually have to have a bit of a focus on, are we going to add mental health in the way that it should be added to the healthcare system that's has been acknowledged by everyone but hasn't been formalized? Are we going to establish a structure for that is inside the Canada Health Act, or is it its own structure? Is it going to be the federal government that funds that entirely, or is it going to be in a different manner? Like, we actually have to decide what is the breadth of the coverage and the depth of the coverage that we're looking to do, and then agree on those outcomes. And unfortunately, what we have going on, as often happens in this case, is we're having a financing discussion, and we're not really agreeing yet on what it is we're trying to buy, let alone the change, quote unquote, that we're trying to buy within the healthcare system. And I think, David, we're
trying to put out fires at the moment, aren't we?
We are. But I would say that the reason that we're not actually moving the health agenda forward very much right now in this back and forth between the federal government and the provincial and territorial governments is in some ways actually because there isn't a pain point that's come to the public policy level, right? Like, Canadians feel it. They express it to pollsters all the time. They see it in their daily lives. They're angry and anxious about what's happening in the healthcare system. But the public policy environment hasn't hit a pain point because provinces actually are doing financially quite well right now. It's not like they need a big check from the federal government. And we just haven't been able to create the environment in which there's consequences for not getting something done. So I think the way you're going to make change happen is that you actually have to first structurally decide on what it is we're trying to buy and how much and what kind of coverage we're trying to get.
Do we need another commission, Jennifer?
No, you stole the words right out of my mouth here. I was going to say, hey, you know what we don't need? We don't need a royal commission. Historically, if you actually look at the impact of royal commissions as a process question, then that's what you started with, David, right? Historically, actually, royal commissions are a way to kick a policy issue like down the field, right? To not have to deal with it right away. Oh, that's an issue under study. We'll get to that later. So I would actually say no, we don't need a royal commission. May the
ghost of Emmett Hall haunt your Christmas.
As I'm sure he will. But you know what? There was an Institute for Fiscal Studies report that came out from the United Kingdom very recently that really caught my eye, because they are likewise dealing with, kind of a tire fire in terms of their public healthcare system as well. And it's, for many of the same sort of symptoms as what we're seeing here in Canada. Mm. And what they concluded actually is, and I think this picks up on a lot of what both Sean and Tyler were saying, is that a big part of the issue here is actually, it's not the stuff that we think of as being core to the healthcare system, the doctors, the nurses, the hospital beds, all that sort of stuff. The problem that they identified actually was the diminishment of community care. And so I think part of the other way that we resolve this issue, to pick up on what both Sean and Tyler have been, the excellent points they've been making here, is that part of this is also about recognizing the continuum of care, some of which we are used to thinking about being part of sort of traditional CHA kind of regulated forms of healthcare in the system, and part of it actually relying on this other level that tends to get ignored, and that's in the community services side.
You want to hear something wild, David? I'm sure Jennifer and Tyler know this, but and listeners may have an intuition. But do you know that medical and hospital care, a doctor and hospital care, which are covered under the Canada Health Act today, represent less than half of all expenditures on healthcare in the country? In fact, drugs are second. In fact, it have been such for 15 or 20 years. So if you think about it that way, we have a single payer model, first dollar single payer coverage for less than half of the system, and then the rest of it, frankly, represents something similar to the way we think about the American system. Some combination of out-of-pocket spending, employer-provided insurance, and public programs for poor people and old people. And I take Tyler's point that especially if you were starting from scratch, you would never design it this way. You would spread those scarce public dollars across a broader range of services, probably with shallower coverage, maybe based on means or something like that. But it seems to me, it will be difficult to get to that kind of plumbing through any kind of reform process. In a way, I think we're mostly stuck with what we have, at least for the foreseeable future. And so the key for the province is going to be, how do they expand capacity when it comes to surgeries and so on? And that's where I do think Quebec represents a bit of a first mover when it comes to bringing on private capacity. I think the Legault government is going to expend some political capital there, and it's worth looking at and watching over the next several months.
So you've all been in government, and here's the challenge of being in government. I recently did a survey in which I asked people how much they would support or not a wide range of different policy ideas. And the number one testing idea across Canada was to take all the services that Tyler was talking about and roll them into the Canada Health Act. Drugs, mental health, long-term care, dentistry, throw it all under the Canada Health Act. Have it run by the Canada Health Act. Number two testing proposition, tax cuts.
People love the Canada Health Act.
and tax cuts.
And tax. Yes, but that's how.
No, but I'm sorry. I'd actually use it to make the point that the Canada Health Act and the principles therein are deeply embedded in the psyche of Canadians as the way things ought to be done when it comes to healthcare, at least.
And
right.
I think your results are also pointing to the fact that there is, this endless demand, basically, for publicly funded goods and services that are provided by somebody else's tax dollars, not mine. Look, that's a perennial problem for sure, for sure. Look, I think one of the challenges, right, of the Canada Health Act model, though, is that if you actually look at the mechanics of it, right, like it's a series of principles, and there's the or else of the federal government can withhold you money. If you look at the mechanics of how that actually works, it is slow. It is like the fact-finding process alone takes for freaking ever. So I don't actually look, I get it. It has symbolic value. People feel really strongly about it, exactly as Tyler said. People like the Canada Health Act, right? They would like to see other things added into it. But in terms of it being sort of the end all be all of the saving kind of Canadian healthcare, I just pay attention to how these things actually work in process, Especially because, as I say, doing so would have effectively double the amount that governments across the country are spending on healthcare, given that presently hospital and physicians are less than half. And it comes back to a kind of set of trade-offs I think we're going to have going forward on the left and the right. That there is scarce public resources. There's going to be growing demands to spend public dollars on the elderly and a kind of short-term or present consumption versus some of the long-term investments that we've been talking about, whether it's innovation, whether it's climate change, et cetera. I don't know, David, I defer to you on these kind of political matters, but I think a kind of underestimated fault line in Canadian
political life is an age-based one. Tyler mentioned some polling this week. What's fascinating is the Conservatives are kind of counterintuitively overperforming with younger voters and underperforming with older voters, which is a kind of flip or the inverse of how politics has been carried out, not just in Canada, but in a lot of Western countries. And one wonders if this kind of age based fault line is something that we're going to have to kind of grapple with, not for the purposes of scoring political points or as a tactical question, but more fundamentally on the kind of cohesion and stability of our society. Because, let's face it, young people have had a pretty tough go at it for the past, several years. And yet so much of our public spending is tilted towards older Canadians and is going to increasingly be tilted towards older Canadians going forward. And that's not limited to healthcare.
It's not, though. I know that I'm going to look at you for the first time in this call as a conservative, and I'm going to say, I know you don't like to hear this, but it's really a deeply embedded part of the Canadian value system. Like, if I ask people in focus groups to talk to me about Canada, this will be one of the first things that comes up as a defining characteristic of the country, right? Now, it's certainly not private. It's certainly not public delivery versus private delivery. And it may, at the end of the day, not even be single payer. But it is definitely that everybody gets health care. Right? So I think at the moment, the bulwark is single payer. But if there isn't improvements in outcomes over time, I could see that breaking.
David, can I just say one other thing on healthcare, which is I think that there's an interesting question about, like, what are to Jen's point, like, what are the goods that we're talking about here, right? Because increasingly, as we work through a period where there isn't this, where we still have a standoff between our governments about what to do in healthcare, I actually am interested to watch whether it moves from being a healthcare reform debate writ large, which is where it is right now, to we're going to preference certain things that we want to move forward on, right? Whether that is mental health or dental or long-term care or whatever. And just how, the kind of competition for the urgency of action ends up playing out in this space, I think will be interesting to watch, because certainly coming out of the pandemic, I think we experienced the healthcare system in a very different way. And we've acknowledged that there are things that the healthcare system doesn't do, particularly I would say in mental health, that has now rocketed up people's agenda as their own concern.
Cool. All right. I want to end by putting you on the spot, each of you, to spontaneously generate either a public policy success you want to celebrate or a public policy failure you want to call out at either the federal or provincial levels in Canada over the past year. Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll go first. I'll be predictable. I really do think it's the Indo-Pacific strategy. I don't want to diminish any of the work that Tyler and his colleagues did over the past 12 months. But I think in terms of Canada's long-run economic and national interest, I think the thing we'll be talking about years from now will be the change, not just in tone, but in the way that the government of Canada conceives of its relationship vis-a-vis China and its place in the world. I think it's a big deal that will have a long-term effects.
And just to be precise, you consider it a success?
I do. I think.
Okay.
I think that this is that's a good point. I think it is a success. And again, I think the fact that it's a broadly shared set of propositions, incidentally, not just in Canada, but also the US, right? Like, for all the talk about dysfunction in Washington, reconceptualizing America's relationship with China is a bipartisan issue, just as it is here. And that's why I think it's a good thing and the most substantive policy development that came out of 2022.
Cool. Tyler, what do you got?
So I would say, and this I would put in the category, I wouldn't call it successful, but I would say in terms of what am I proud of this country, of what we've done, I would say a lot of what's happened on a multi-partisan level in how Canada has responded to support Ukraine in what's going on in Eastern Europe, because it is really a battle for the future of democracy. I think a lot of us should hold up as something that we as Canadians are proud of. Canada has over-donated relative to some of our peers. We need to keep doing that. I think that's the challenge going forward: is how does that remain in the forefront of people's minds when there's lots of other things as this war continues that will compete for interest and urgency. But I just think as Canadians, we've responded. We've done a lot of things to support the people in Ukraine, and that is obviously one that Canada has a close connection to because of our diaspora relationship.
So I agree with that, but I would also observe, Tyler, that as we speak, Kiev has no water, heat, or light, I don't think, and support for doing more for Ukraine is dropping like a stone in all of the Western nations in the world.
Yep. No, keeping focus on that issue is hard as it becomes a prolonged and protracted fight, for sure.
Yeah. Jennifer, what do you got?
You asked for hits as well as like
hits or misses, whatever you got.
Misses. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll use that. It sounds like it's a baseball metaphor. So, okay. So in terms of a hit, and by the way, like I'm going to be focused here on stuff that's like domestic, tax and transfer policy, kind of my usual bailiwick. So hit, I would say, is that in this environment when so many different governments have been looking for ways to take the edge off of the affordability crisis and do something. I actually thought that the temporary GST top-up was actually smart policy, highly targeted, timely, 2.5 billion, but actually delivered in a way that it's going to reach 11 million people who actually need the help. It's not going to lead to excess demand. It's not going to be working counter to what the Bank of Canada is trying to achieve. So that was actually, I thought, like smart policy. One, I guess, that I would say is like a swing and a miss would be the dental benefit. In terms of the design, it's, conditional cash transfer, the list of like, you must have, done the following things before you can even think about applying is really long. It's not a substitute for actually improving accessibility and supply of dental services. I get it. There was pressure to deliver a thing before the end of the year. It's a temporary thing. Hopefully we'll learn some lessons from it. But so those would be my two compare and contrast.
It kept Jagmeet happy for another year. It's a small price to pay. But tax lady, I got a question for you.
Okay.
I did a deep dive into food insecurity in some research this year. And one of the things I found was that people, when they fall into food insecurity, become dramatically less likely to file their tax returns.
That's really interesting.
Not just that year, but for years to come.
Right.
It's part of falling out of, the society that they were part of.
Right.
And so I'm interested in whether you and I guess all three of you think we should be continuing to deliver core benefits like that through a tax system that people have to apply for to receive, rather than, if you think people need the benefit, why not just give it to them?
I feel like this is like it's like you tossed the ball at me and then anyway. So a couple of things on that. That is really super interesting. I had not been aware of that relationship between food insecurity and then not filing, although it makes perfect sense to me. Food insecurity is fundamentally an income issue. And people who are in low income are less likely to file a tax return, even when it would mean a substantial improvement in terms of their income and access to income tested benefits and services. And that's everything from like subsidized housing to, proving their income to qualify for things like extended healthcare benefits and provincial systems. The challenge here, right, is that we have a tax agency that is set up to be really good at verifying people's annual incomes based on their annual tax returns. And they share that information with a whole bunch of other government departments, federal and provincial, that rely on it a lot. And it's important information. They're good at that part. What they suck at, and they suck ass at this, really, is honestly, it's the social service stuff, right? They are not good at being, for better terms, basically social welfare workers. right? They're really not good at that. So let them continue to deliver the benefits that are kind of hardwired into the tax system. Child benefits, right? That's a success story for sure. GST credit, success story for sure. But continuing to add on, sort of new bits and pieces that people then have to go and deal with the tax agency to get access to, with the threat of file reviews and repayment and all the rest of it. No, not a good idea. Maximize their role in terms of sharing that information and get them better information and faster information that reduces the burden on individual income tax payers, so that we can do a better job of connecting people to the benefits and programs that'll help them.
Tyler, you look like you have something to say about this.
Oh, well, I almost feel like this is going back to a conversation Jen and I were having on Twitter very recently. We absolutely need to do everything that Jen just said. And I would even go a step further in saying, we've created a bunch of these programs. They are statutory benefits. They are things that Canadians are entitled to, and Canadians ought to get them. And if we're not getting them to those people, we have an obligation to get them to those people. And that's just the right thing to do in Canada. And we have, CRA, people like to crap on CRA for lots of reasons. They, have challenging situations, interactions with them. But the people at CRA do a very important and generally a very good job at what they do. But the one thing that they haven't been able to do, which they could do, would be to take that information that they know about Canadians and actually find the ability to get that stuff in the hands of people that they're entitled to. We have the ability, with not much difficulty, to be able to autofill what people are entitled to. We could very easily prepare tax returns for most Canadians that are simple and easy, that would get them connected to the benefits they're entitled to. It just takes some leadership and a bit of technology to be able to do that better. And frankly, it's the right thing to do.
I have nothing to add, David. You're talking to two of the country's leading experts on these issues.
I'm not going to venture into either. I'm just going to say to the three of you, oh my God, thank you. What a great conversation. I mean, I was sick and it's Friday. I thought maybe we'll get this done before 6. We're way over time. We've gone like an hour and 20 minutes because it was so damn interesting. The three of you.
Did you finish your drink?
Not quite. Very close. Very close. I hope to God I can have you back, the three of you. This was a great, great conversation, and I feel privileged that all three of you made the time to do it. Tyler, good luck in whatever you're off to do, right? Sean, continue to search for the sensible soul of conservatism.
Well, I will, and I'll just say that Tyler and I, in a bout of bipartisanship, are teaching together in the winter term. This conversation will continue, maybe over drinks or something like that after class.
Yes.
Nice. And Jen, keep turning out those great products out of your school that you do. I've had the great fortune to meet a number of graduates, and it's an impressive bunch.
Thank you. Thanks for this conversation today.
That's right. I have to and want to thank my presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail, and everybody who watched or listened. Tune in next week. We'll be back with more Herle Burly, but I doubt it'll be better than this. Thanks a lot.
Herle Burly, Herle Burly, Herle Burly, Herle Burly, Herle Burly.